What is painting? What is painting all about? The problem of painting is the problem of the imagination. Why is this? Well, the painter is someone who envisions. Why? Why does he envision? Well, he responds to what everybody sees as something unacceptable, something that asks us to respond, not to accept passively, even mechanically, as many may be tempted to do, but to turn back upon it, to respond to it by envisioning something that is, well, peculiarly human, at the heart of what is apparent to all, even though we don't quite understand what we see, what is given to us to see. So, what does the painter do? Well, he imagines, he envisions. In envisioning, he sees a human world at the heart of what is given to us. What may be considered today as natural, but which is in early antiquity understood to be divine. The human in painting finds itself at the heart of the divine, bears witness to its presence at the heart of the divine. And this may be said to be the case in all painting, cave painting included. Now, the imagination of a cave painter is still visibly stunned by what he sees outside of himself. It will require discourse, reason, to purge the imagination of the passions. When we have refined painting, what we have is a refined imagination. This refinement comes about through discourse, through studied discourse, dialogue, that clears the imagination of compulsion. That is reasoning. Where the imagination is purged of compulsions, and that is the work of reason. The painter sees what is to paint. He envisions in a refined manner. What does he see? He sees the human, the element of freedom, at the heart of natural necessity. And so he bears witness to that element. Being freedom bound to natural divine necessity, freedom is virtue. It is not a matter of doing whatever you please, but it is tied to questions of life and death, to necessity, irreducible necessity. And there the human is seated at the heart, in the very belly of divine necessity. So when you see a refined painting or drawing, you will see an element of freedom that is cast in recognizable terms. If you look outside and you have an ordinary experience of life, and you look at a painting and you say, well, I recognize that there's something that is in common with, sure. So the context is divine necessity, which we are all exposed to. But there is also an element, and that is what is key to the painting, to the drawing, an element of freedom that comes to the fore. And now with modern painting, we have a tendency for freedom to be alienated from that natural necessity. And so with the rise of the modern sense of self, which will lead to the modern historical consciousness, what we have is a progressive alienation of freedom from necessity. Necessity is seen as something external to freedom, and so freedom loses the character of virtue that it has in classical antiquity, and even in the Middle Ages, or even in the Renaissance. So what we have is a new type of painting which is supposed to express the contents of this new self. And the contents are the feelings, the sentiment, which is a passive thing, but it amounts to the way in which this new self is affected by reality. And it's so affected in a peculiar way. It does not know the terrible way in which reality affects fallen man. Caliban in Shakespeare's Tempest is a fine example of this. And he is not affected by reality the way a rational man would be. So, rational in classical terms. So how is he affected? He is affected in a symbolic manner. He is at a further remove from reality, for he is now within this shell of quasi or symbolic autonomy. Who is this he? Well, it is none other than consciousness that has determined itself as this new symbolic self. And so the new self is, or consciousness as determined in this new self, the modern self, is at war, in fact, with necessity, and can approach necessity only in one or two ways. One, by welcoming it as a means to establish itself in the service of freedom, or as an enemy that must be shunned. And so accordingly, what we have in the modern world is by and large two takes on the question of divinity, the divine, and God. So God is either useful to us to prop ourselves up, to justify ourselves, or God is a nuisance, an obstacle to our freedom, and we must shun it. So, in painting, what we have is the glorification of the imagination in terms of feelings. The experience of God, not God, is what counts here. The sentiment, the feeling is what fills the gap between the human and ultimate reality, the divine. It does so symbolically, and the fate of modern painting indicates that it fails ultimately, entirely, to breach the gap between the human and the divine. So, what is the proper? At this point, we can discern what the proper role of painting and also of the imagination is. That is to seek out a freedom at the heart of necessity. And this is best done where reason purges, purifies the imagination of compulsions. And so we find what sometimes is called expression, but in fact, there is a manifestation of the human, at the heart of the divine. And this is what deserves to be called heroic, because the human at the heart of the divine is sustained by the divine. And so the divine is not justifying the human in a modern Machiavellian way. The divine is caring for the human, sustaining it, not justifying it in the face of a third party, or not serving the interests of freedom altogether. For indeed, freedom finds itself at the heart of necessity. What does that mean? It means here that freedom breathes, gains itself by positioning itself at the heart of necessity, by giving itself to necessity. So the painter must be given himself to necessity. And this is the work of the imagination. Imagination is not active. It is about openness to reality. But again, it is not openness tainted by compulsion that gives us a graceful painting. It is an imagination that is immaculate, that can offer us, ultimately, the human free from impurities, the human delicately seated at the heart of the divine. This, in a nutshell, is what painting is really all about. And there can be deviations. There can be all kinds of ways of framing painting in terms of, well, in technical terms, in terms of even this rise of the self, of the modern self, of the individual, or of portraying a naturalistic world. We could say something to that effect. And while there is a clear link between the painting and what everybody else sees, the non-painter sees outside in his ordinary life. Um, the goal is not to reproduce that ordinary experience. The attempt to reproduce that ordinary experience leads to a mechanical form of painting, which ultimately is photography. So a matter of grasping and so mechanical reproduction. And that is not freedom. It's sham freedom, which is detached from and abstracted from necessity mechanically, and ultimately collapses as Icarus does in the dark waters of antiquity.